Crunch. That is the sound of a glass ampoule shattering between teeth. Pierre Laval is convulsing on the floor of cell 12. He wanted to end his life like a Roman, escaping the firing squad with cyanide. But the poison was old. It failed. Now the doctors are forcing a tube down his throat. They aren't showing mercy. They are doing something insane, pumping his stomach and dragging him back from death, just so they can shoot him an hour later. Pierre Jean-Marie Laval was born in 1883 in the rugged volcanic heart of France, the Auvergne, in the village of Châteldon. It is a place of dark stone and hard people. The Auvergnats are known in France for being stubborn, frugal, and fiercely independent. They are the Scots of France, people who save every centime, who work until their backs break, and who trust no one from the capital. Born far from the halls of power, Laval grew up surrounded by the smell of meat and wine in his father's butcher shop. His father was the village butcher and cafe owner, a man of rough hands and limited horizons. But it was his appearance that defined his early life more than his class. From a young age, Pierre was swarthy. He had dark, oily skin, thick lips, and coarse, curly black hair. In the casual, pervasive racism of late 19th century France, he did not look French. He looked to his tormentors like a Moor, a North African, or a Gypsy. Throughout his life, this physical difference would be weaponized against him. Aristocrats would later whisper that he had dirty blood. Cartoonists would draw him with exaggerated, grotesque features. This constant othering planted a seed of resentment deep in his gut. It created a chip on his shoulder the size of the Massif Central. He learned early on that he would never be accepted into the elite clubs of Paris by birthright or charm. He would have to force his way in. He would have to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the pale-skinned boys from the preparatory schools. He was a brilliant student, fueled by this burning need to prove them wrong. He devoured books, clawing his way out of the village to a lycée in Lyon, and then, inevitably, to Paris. But Paris was cold to the butcher's son. He tried to enter the prestigious academic path, the Cyanide, but he failed. It was a sting to his intellectual vanity, but it taught him a valuable lesson. Abstract theory was not his strength. His strength was the spoken word, the deal, the argument. He turned to law. It was the natural habitat for a man who could talk his way out of or into anything. By 1907, he was a lawyer in Paris, but he wasn't chasing corporate clients. He set up his practice in the grimy industrial suburbs, the red belt around the city. He represented the poor, the trade unionists, the anarchists. He became the poor man's lawyer. In these early days, he was scruffy and intense, his clothes smelling of the cheap tobacco he chain-smoked as he stood in drafty courtrooms defending factory workers accused of striking. He was magnetic. Rejecting the flowery, Latin-infused French of the elite lawyers, he spoke the language of the street. He was earthy. He was relatable. He was a socialist, a card-carrying member of the SFIO, the French section of the Workers' International. The man who would one day collaborate with Nazis began his career fighting for the proletariat. In 1914, just as the Great War was about to engulf Europe, the workers of Aubervilliers elected him to the Chamber of Deputies. He was the youngest socialist in the parliament. He was on the government's watch list as a dangerous pacifist. Police files from the time described him as a potential agitator, a man who might urge soldiers to lay down their rifles. When World War I broke out, instead of rushing to the colors with patriotic fervor, he viewed the slaughter of the trenches with a cold, cynical eye. He saw it not as glory, but as waste, a waste of French blood. This conviction, that war is the ultimate failure, and must be avoided at any price, would become the bedrock of his philosophy. It was a noble idea that would eventually lead him down the darkest path imaginable. It was during these early years in the chamber that he adopted the symbol that would haunt him. The Chamber of Deputies was a sea of black frock coats and somber gray suits. It was a uniform of conformity. Laval, the outsider, the butcher's son with the dark skin, needed to stand out. He needed a visual hook. He started wearing a white piqué tie, not a formal bow tie, but a regular necktie, stark white, against his dark shirts and suits. It was garish. It was tasteless. It was perfect. In the dim, smoke-filled corridors of power, you could always see Laval coming. The white tie became his brand. It signaled, I am here. I am different. I am the man you have to deal with. But as the 1920s roared in, something shifted in the soul of the young socialist. The firebrand lawyer began to taste real power, and he found he liked it. He looked around at his socialist comrades with their rigid dogmas and endless committee meetings, and he felt stifled. He began to realize that ideology was a cage. He saw himself as a pragmatist in a world of dreamers. Why fight the system when you could master it? Why scream from the outside when you could whisper from the inside? Slowly, imperceptibly, the red Laval began to fade. He started taking on wealthier clients. He started making friends with the very industrialists he used to sue. He discovered a terrifying talent within himself, the ability to find the middle ground where no one else could see it. He could get a communist and a conservative to agree on a budget, provided Laval got a cut of the credit. He became the fixer, and with this new role came money, serious money. The lawyer from the slums began buying property. He bought a newspaper, Le Moniteur, turning it into his personal mouthpiece. He invested in printing presses. He bought the radio station Radio Lion. And in a move of supreme psychological significance, he went back to his hometown of Châteldon and bought the medieval chateau that loomed over the village. The butcher's son was now the lord of the manor. He looked down on the people who had once looked down on him. This accumulation of wealth was rapid and suspicious. Rumors swirled in Paris. How does a deputy on a government salary afford a chateau and a media empire? Was it insider trading? Was it blackmail? Laval just smiled his oily smile and adjusted his white tie. He didn't care about the rumors. He knew that in the chaotic, revolving door politics of the French Third Republic, money was the lubricant of power. He was building a fortress of influence, solidified by stone. He was no longer a socialist. He was an independent, which in Laval's language meant he was loyal only to himself. By the early 1930s, the transformation was complete. The agitator had become the establishment. But he was a strange kind of establishment. He didn't belong to the right, and he no longer belonged to the left. He floated above the parties, a lone wolf operator who sneered at the parliamentary chatterboxes. To him, democracy was no longer a sacred trust. It was merely a messy, inefficient market where votes were bought and sold, and he was the best merchant in the bazaar. He looked at the rising dictatorships in Europe, Mussolini in Rome, Stalin in Moscow, and the screaming little man in Berlin. And he didn't feel fear. He felt a challenge. He believed with a fatal, blinding arrogance that he could handle them. He thought the same skills he used to settle labor disputes in Aubervilliers could be used to stop a world war. He was about to step onto the world stage, armed with nothing but his white tie and his colossal vanity, walking straight into the jaws of monsters. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the global atmosphere darkened. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. France, protected by its colonial empire and gold reserves, felt the impact later than Germany or Britain, but the rot was setting in. Factories closed. Unemployment rose. The street violence between the far-right leagues and the communist paramilitaries grew bloodier. The Third Republic seemed incapable of handling the crisis. Cabinets were formed and dissolved in weeks. The French people were tired. They were tired of the shouting, tired of the inaction, tired of the parliamentary circus. Laval watched this paralysis with a growing disdain. His cynicism was hardening into a worldview. He began to believe that democracy, in its current form, was obsolete. It was too slow, too messy for the modern world. He looked at the efficiency of the authoritarian regimes rising in Europe and felt a secret, guilty admiration. He didn't want to be a dictator, at least not yet, but he wanted the power of a dictator to get things done. He started preaching the gospel of technocracy and efficiency. He told the French people that what they needed wasn't more ideology, but a competent manager, someone who could balance the books, someone who could make the trains run on time, someone like him. His rise was inevitable. In January 1931, the kaleidoscope of French politics shifted again, and Pierre Laval landed at the very top. He was named president of the council, prime minister. He was 47 years old, one of the youngest men to hold the office. The outsider had captured the citadel. He formed a government that was a reflection of himself, vague in ideology, heavy on pragmatism, and obsessed with stability. He retained the Ministry of the Interior for himself, giving him control over the police and the secret files. He loved the files. He loved knowing the secrets of his enemies and his friends. It was the ultimate leverage. But leading France in 1931 was like captaining a ship in a gathering hurricane. To the east, the Weimar Republic in Germany was collapsing. The reparations payments from World War I were drying up. The shadow of Adolf Hitler was lengthening across the Rhine. Laval, the man who believed every man had a price and every conflict had a compromise, looked at the map of Europe and decided he could fix it. He believed he could weave a web of alliances that would trap Germany in a cage of diplomacy. He prepared to travel to Washington, to Berlin, to Rome. He was about to embark on a diplomatic high-wire act that would dazzle the world. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed to work. He was hailed as a modern statesman. Time magazine in America, the arbiter of global fame, selected him as their Man of the Year for 1931. They called him the French Barnum, a showman capable of pulling rabbits out of hats, describing his swarthy ambition and peasant cunning. It was the peak of his career. He stood on the balcony of the Hôtel Matignon, believing he was untouchable. But in the ancient Greek tragedies, the moment a man is raised to the heavens is the precise moment the gods begin to sharpen their knives. Beneath the accolades, the fatal flaw was growing. Laval had convinced himself that he was smarter than the system, that personal charm could replace national principle. He did not know it yet, but the Man of the Year was about to walk into a decade where the only currency that mattered was not gold or influence, but blood. The 1930s were not a time for amateurs. The architecture of European peace built so carefully at Versailles in 1919 was crumbling. Germany was rearming. The League of Nations, that great temple of idealistic hope, was proving to be made of glass. In this terrifying landscape, Pierre Laval looked around and decided that he, and he alone, possessed the genius to stop the coming war. His strategy was simple, cynical, and purely mechanical. He would build a cage around Germany. He didn't care about ideology. He didn't care about morality. He only cared about leverage. He would forge a ring of steel by allying with anyone, literally anyone, who had a gun pointed at Berlin. This ushered in the era of Laval's diplomatic waltz. It was a performance of breathtaking energy and questionable ethics. He traveled to Washington to charm President Hoover. He traveled to Berlin to look the Germans in the eye, but his most dangerous gambits lay to the east and the south. In 1935, Laval, now serving as foreign minister, made a pilgrimage to Moscow. It was a surreal spectacle. Here was the arch-pragmatist of capitalism, the man who crushed strikes in France, shaking the hand of Joseph Stalin, the Red Tsar. They signed the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke, a resurrection of the old alliance that had saved France in 1914. But in reality, it was a hollow shell. Laval had no intention of actually sharing military secrets with the Bolsheviks. He just wanted the headline. He wanted Hitler to see the photo of the handshake and tremble. He treated the Soviet Union not as a nation but as a scarecrow to be propped up in a field. It was a dangerous game of bluff, and Stalin, a man who understood power far better than Laval, knew exactly what the Frenchman was doing. But if the Soviet pact was a bluff, his dealings with Italy were a deal with the devil. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, was posturing in Rome, dreaming of a new Roman Empire. Laval looked at Mussolini and didn't see a fascist thug. He saw a potential counterweight to Hitler. He believed he could seduce Italy away from Germany's embrace. In January 1935, Laval arrived in Rome. The atmosphere was electric with pomp and circumstance. He was feted like an emperor. And in the gilded halls of the Palazzo Venezia, amidst the marble and the tapestries, the two men sat down to redraw the map. What happened in those rooms is the subject of one of history's most damning controversies. They spoke about Austria, about the Balkans, and then the conversation turned to Africa. Mussolini wanted Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia. He wanted a colony to prove Italy's virility. Laval, eager to please, eager to secure Mussolini's friendship against Hitler, made a gesture. He famously told Mussolini that France would give Italy a free hand, main libre, in Ethiopia. Laval would later claim, until his dying breath, that he only meant a free hand in economic terms, trade, railways, investment. But Mussolini heard what he wanted to hear. He heard permission to invade. He heard that France would look the other way, while Italian bombers rained mustard gas on Ethiopian villages. This was the essence of Laval's diplomacy, calculated ambiguity. He spoke in winks and nods, believing he was being clever, believing he could promise everything to everyone without ever paying the bill. He thought he had bought Italian loyalty with Ethiopian blood. He was wrong. He had bought nothing but shame. When Mussolini's tanks rolled into Ethiopia later that year, the world was horrified. The League of Nations, which France was sworn to uphold, clamored for sanctions against Italy. Laval was trapped. On one side, the British and the French public demanded justice for Ethiopia. On the other, his friend Mussolini demanded the support he had been promised. A man of principle would have chosen a side. Laval chose to scheme. He entered into secret negotiations with the British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare. Together, in a smoke-filled room in Paris, they devised the infamous Hoare-Laval Pact. It was 19th century imperialism at its worst. They took a map of Ethiopia and drew a line across it with a pencil. They agreed to offer Mussolini 2/3 of the country, the fertile, useful parts, and leave the desperate corridor for camels to the Ethiopian emperor. They prepared to carve up a sovereign member of the League of Nations and serve it to a dictator on a silver platter, all in the name of peace. They thought they could present this as a fait accompli, but they forgot one thing: the press. In December 1935, the details of the secret pact leaked to a French newspaper. The explosion was nuclear. The public in London and Paris was outraged. It was viewed as a betrayal of every value the democracy stood for. Samuel Hoare was forced to resign in disgrace, and in France the French Barnum was suddenly seen as a moral leper. The government fell in January 1936. Laval was swept out of office, his reputation in tatters. This fall from grace is crucial to understanding the monster he would become 4 years later. Laval retreated to his chateau in Châteaudun, but he did not go quietly. He sat in his study, surrounded by his antiques, and stewed in a toxic brew of resentment. He didn't blame himself for the failure. He didn't blame his duplicity. He blamed the British. He blamed the hypocritical English who had hung him out to dry. He blamed the idealists and the parliamentary chatterboxes who didn't understand that you have to break a few eggs or nations to make an omelet. A deep, festering Anglophobia took root in his heart. He began to convince himself that France's true enemy wasn't Germany, but England, the treacherous ally that had ruined his grand design. He watched from the sidelines as the leftist Popular Front government took power in 1936, sneering at their attempts to give workers paid holidays while Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland. He saw the strikes, the chaos, the polarization, and he felt a grim satisfaction. Let them fail, he thought. Let them see that their precious democracy is weak. During these years in the wilderness, 1936 to 1939, Laval mutated. The hubris that had made him think he could manipulate Mussolini now hardened into a messianic complex. He believed that he was the only man who saw the truth, that democracy was dead, that fascism was the future, and that France had to adapt or perish. He waited like a spider in the center of his web, watching the clouds gather over Europe, knowing that sooner or later the storm would break, the system would collapse, and they would have to come crawling back to him. He continued to hold court at Châteaudun, receiving visitors, keeping his files updated, nursing his grudges. He told anyone who would listen that the war was lost before it began. He predicted catastrophe. And when the catastrophe finally arrived in 1940, Pierre Laval didn't weep for France. He straightened his white tie, lit a cigarette, and prepared to collect his winnings. The man of the year was dead. The gravedigger of the Republic was born. Summer 1940. It was the season the sky fell. In the span of 6 weeks, the French army, reputed to be the finest land force in Europe, evaporated like mist under the tracks of German panzers. The roads of France were a river of human misery. Millions of refugees clutching mattresses and bird cages fled south, mixed with retreating soldiers who had thrown away their rifles. It was more than a military defeat. It was a total moral collapse. The Third Republic, the system Laval had served and despised in equal measure, had ceased to function. The government fled Paris, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux, a traveling circus of panic and recrimination. While others wept or burned documents, Pierre Laval felt a strange electric surge of energy. This was the moment he had predicted. This was the apocalypse he had warned about. For a man of his temperament, there is a dark satisfaction in seeing the world burn if you were the one who sold the fire insurance. He looked at the chaos and saw opportunity. The old order was dead. It was time to build a new one, and he would be the architect. The drifting government eventually washed up in the spa town of Vichy. It was a surreal choice. Vichy was a town of casinos, luxury hotels, and thermal baths, a playground for the rheumatic rich. Now, its velvet-lined gaming rooms and opera houses were turned into makeshift ministries. Typewriters clattered on baccarat tables. Diplomats slept in bathtubs. In this claustrophobic, overheated atmosphere, Pierre Laval went to work. His goal was audacious. He wanted the French Parliament to vote itself out of existence. He wanted the democratically elected representatives of the people to voluntarily hand over absolute dictatorial power to one man, Marshal Philippe Pétain. Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, was the figurehead. He was the grandfatherly idol the French people clung to in their grief. But Pétain was senile, vain, and bewildered by the speed of events. He needed a pit bull. He needed someone to grab the Parliament by the throat and force it to submit. That was Laval's job. For days leading up to the vote on July 10, 1940, Laval was a whirlwind. He set up his headquarters in the hall of the Hôtel du Parc. He was everywhere. He cajoled, he threatened, he bribed, he lied. He grabbed terrified deputies by the lapels, his face inches from theirs, smelling of sweat and tobacco. "Germany has won," he would shout. "England is finished. If we do not adapt, if we do not create a new authoritarian state that Hitler respects, France will be erased from the map like Poland." He played on their fears. He told the conservatives that only Pétain could save them from communism. He told the socialists that only Pétain could protect the workers from the harshness of occupation. He was a master psychological manipulator, turning their panic into submission. He wasn't just arguing for a change of government. He was arguing for a national revolution. He claimed that the defeat was not caused by German tanks, but by the spirit of enjoyment of the French people. Too much democracy, too many holidays, too little discipline. It was a message of national masochism, and in their trauma, the politicians bought it. The final act of the tragedy took place in the Grand Casino of Vichy. It was a setting worthy of a satire. The deputies and senators gathered in the opera theater under the crystal chandeliers where tenors had once sung arias. Now the stage was set for a suicide. Laval took the podium. He didn't speak with sadness. He spoke with contempt. He lacerated the parliamentary system that had nurtured him. He told them they were obsolete. When the vote was called, the result was a landslide. 569 votes for the death of the Republic. Only 80 brave souls voted no. As the results were read out, Laval stood with his arms crossed, a smirk beneath his mustache. He had done it. He had legally assassinated French democracy. He had handed the keys of the nation to an old marshal and, by extension, to himself. But here lies the twisted dynamic that would define the next 4 years. Pétain and Laval were now partners, tied together like two men in a three-legged race, but they loathed each other. To Pétain, the aristocrat of the army, Laval was a vulgar, dirty creature. He was a necessary evil, a sewer cleaner, needed to do the filthy work of dealing with the Germans. Pétain wanted to rule like a king from the past. Laval wanted to rule like a mafia boss from the future. Laval knew Pétain despised him. He famously quipped, "The marshal is a china vase. I am the earthenware pot that protects him. If we collide, I am the one who gets chipped." But he accepted the insults because he believed he held the real power. Pétain had the glory. Laval had the brain. As the summer of 1940 turned to autumn, Laval felt invincible. He was now the vice premier of France. He believed he had saved his country from total annihilation. He believed he had positioned France to be Germany's favorite partner in the new Europe. He was ready to meet the conquerors. He was ready to look Adolf Hitler in the eye and cut a deal. He packed his bags, adjusted his white tie, and prepared for the most infamous handshake in French history. He did not know that he was walking into a room where his skills as a small-town lawyer would be as useless as a paper shield against a flamethrower. October 22nd, 1940. A small, nondescript train station at Montoire-sur-le-Loire, a quiet commune in central France. The station is swarming with SS guards. On the track sits a steel beast, the Erika, Adolf Hitler's armored command train. Pierre Laval steps onto the platform. He adjusts his white tie, checks his cufflinks, and walks forward. He is about to attempt the greatest gamble of his life. He believes that with his charm, his peasant cunning, and his negotiation skills, he can tame the monster of the 20th century. He believes he is walking into a diplomatic summit. In reality, he is walking into a cage. Laval meets Hitler 2 days before Marshal Pétain does. It is a crucial detail often forgotten. Laval wants to prepare the ground. He walks into the carriage and sees the Führer. Hitler is cold, distant, his eyes boring into the little Frenchman. Laval tries to be the good broker. He tries to banter. He says, "You have crushed us. We are defeated, but I want to build a future where France has a place." He talks about partnership. He talks about European unity. Hitler nods, barely listening. To Hitler, France is not a partner. It is a defeated vassal state, a source of food, factories, and bases to attack Britain. He needs France to stay quiet and productive. If this little man with the bad teeth and the desperate smile can deliver that, fine. Hitler uses Laval's vanity against him. He lets Laval believe he is being listened to. 2 days later, on October 24th, the trap snaps shut. Marshal Pétain arrives, the cameras click. The image is seared into history, the handshake. Pétain, the old soldier, shaking the hand of the Nazi warlord. But look at the background, hovering there, beaming like a proud father, is Pierre Laval. He orchestrated this. He made it happen. He views this photograph not as a badge of shame, but as a trophy. He believes he has just secured France's survival. Laval returns to Paris drunk on his own perceived success. He goes on the radio and utters the word that will poison the French soul for generations. "I envisage," he says, "a collaboration between our two countries." Collaboration. Before this moment, it was an innocent word. After this moment, it meant treason. Laval meant it in the transactional sense. I give you this, you give me that. But the Germans took everything and gave nothing. They kept the 2 million French prisoners of war in camps. They kept the exorbitant occupation costs. They kept rationing the food until French children were fainting in schools. Laval's partnership was a delusion. He was feeding a crocodile, hoping it would eat him last. But back in Vichy, the knives were being sharpened. Marshal Pétain had had enough. He was tired of Laval blowing smoke in his face. He was tired of Laval acting like he owned the government. He was tired of the rumors that Laval planned to overthrow him. The old soldiers around Pétain, the reactionaries, who hated democracy but also hated the Germans, convinced the marshal that Laval was a liability. He was too close to the Nazis. He was too vulgar. He had to go. December 13th, 1940, Friday the 13th, a date Laval should have been wary of. The cabinet meets in the Hôtel du Parc. The atmosphere is tense. Pétain sits stone-faced. Suddenly, he demands that all ministers sign a letter of resignation to allow for a reshuffle. Laval signs, smirking, thinking it is just another political game. He thinks he will be reappointed immediately. Then Pétain drops the hammer. "Everyone is reappointed," the marshal says, his voice trembling with age and anger, "except Monsieur Laval." Laval is stunned. He tries to argue. He tries to use his famous powers of persuasion. But the guards are already there. He is arrested on the spot. He is dragged out of his office, his papers confiscated. He is driven back to his chateau in Châteldon, placed under house arrest. For a few terrifying hours, there is talk of court-martialing him, even executing him for plotting against the state. The king of Vichy has fallen. He is alone, powerless, stripped of his title. But then, something revealing happens. Something that strips away the last shred of the lie that Laval was working for France. The Germans find out. Otto Abetz, the Nazi ambassador to Paris, is furious. He races to Vichy with an armed escort. He kicks down doors. He screams at Pétain. He demands Laval's release. Why? Because Laval is their man. The Germans know that Pétain is a senile patriot, but Laval's a compromised pragmatist they can use. They need him. Abetz forces Pétain to release Laval. He drives Laval back to Paris, effectively under German protection. This is the turning point. Before December 1940, Laval could claim he was a French politician, acting independently. After December 1940, he owes his life and his freedom entirely to the German occupier. He is no longer just a collaborator. He is a creature of the enemy. He retreats to Paris, nursing a cold, hard hatred for Pétain and the men who betrayed him. He waits in the shadows, watching the war turn, knowing that the Germans will eventually force Pétain to take him back. And he knows that when he returns, there will be no more mercy. For the entirety of 1941, Pierre Laval lived as a ghost haunting the occupied zone. Banished from the seat of government in Vichy, he set up a shadow court in Paris, operating out of a requisitioned office on the Champs-Élysées. He was a man in limbo, protected only by the German bayonets that surrounded the city. He spent his days in a cloud of cigarette smoke, whispering in the ears of Nazi officials, pouring poison into their minds about the senile fools running the government in the South. He cultivated a deep radioactive bitterness. He watched as his replacement, Admiral Darlan, tried and failed to navigate the impossible demands of Berlin. Laval knew the Germans would eventually tire of Darlan's hesitation. He knew that in a total war, the occupier doesn't want a reluctant partner. They want a willing accomplice. He simply had to wait for the inevitable crisis that would force them to call him back. But while he waited for power, death came for him first. On August 27, 1941, Laval traveled to the Bourgneys des Bourgs barracks in Versailles. The occasion was a dark ceremonial send-off for the first contingent of the LVF, the Legion of French Volunteers Against Bolshevism. These were Frenchmen wearing German field gray uniforms, preparing to march into the Russian winter for Hitler. Laval didn't care for these fanatics. He privately thought they were cannon fodder, but he needed to be seen. He walked among the ranks, reviewing the troops, playing the role of the statesman. Suddenly, a young man named Paul Colette stepped out from the crowd of volunteers. Colette was not a communist agent. He was a French patriot who had enlisted that very morning solely to get within killing range of the traitors. He raised a 6.35 millimeter pistol and fired at point-blank range. 5 shots cracked through the parade ground air. Laval crumpled. A bullet had punched through his chest, lodging millimeters from his heart. Another grazed his arm. He collapsed into the dirt, his white tie quickly soaking up the red stain of his own blood. For a few frantic minutes, amidst the screaming and the stomping of boots, it seemed the story of Pierre Laval was over. He should have died on that pavement. Instead, he survived with a freakish resilience. Rushed to a hospital, he lay clinging to life while surgeons debated removing the bullet. They decided it was too close to the heart to operate, so they left it there. For the rest of his life, Laval would carry a piece of lead fired by a patriot inside his chest, a heavy, physical reminder of his nation's hatred. But his reaction to the assassination attempt revealed the true depth of his cynicism. Lying in his hospital bed, pale and weak, he did not demand execution for the shooter. He told the police, "Do not guillotine him. It was a professional hazard." He saw the political angle immediately. He spun the shooting into a narrative of martyrdom. He told the Germans, "I have shed my blood for our collaboration." He used his own near-death experience as a bargaining chip to prove his loyalty. By the spring of 1942, the prophecy Laval had made in exile came true. The war had turned against Germany. The Wehrmacht was freezing in Russia. The United States had entered the conflict. Hitler needed more from France, more workers, more industrial output, more police enforcement. He was done with the polite hesitancy of Admiral Darlan. The order came down from Berlin, sharp and non-negotiable. Get rid of the admiral. We want Laval. It was an ultimatum. If Marshal Pétain refused, the Germans threatened to occupy the entire country and appoint a Nazi Gauleiter to rule France directly, erasing the last fiction of French sovereignty. On April 18, 1942, Pierre Laval returned to Vichy. But this was not the same man who had been kicked out 2 years earlier. He did not return as a subordinate. He returned as a conqueror imposed by the enemy. The meeting between Laval and Pétain was frigid. The old marshal, who viewed Laval with physical revulsion, was forced to sign the papers handing over the keys to the kingdom. Laval demanded and received the title of head of government. He took personal control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Ministry of Information. He effectively stripped Pétain of all real authority, leaving the old soldier as nothing more than a statue to be wheeled out for ceremonies. Laval settled back into his office at the Hôtel du Parc, the bullet still aching in his chest. He looked at the files Darlan had left behind and sneered. He believed he was the only adult in the room, the only one strong enough to do the dirty work necessary to keep France alive. He decided to double down, no more ambiguity, no more stalling. He would bind France so tightly to the German war machine that the two nations would sink or swim together. He believed that by giving Hitler everything he asked for, labor, resources, police cooperation, he could buy France a seat at the table in the new Europe. It was a gambler's fallacy, a desperate bet made with other people's lives. He straightened his papers, lit a cigarette, and prepared to unleash a reign of administrative terror that would stain his soul forever. The summer of 1942 descended on France like a suffocating blanket. The initial shock of defeat had worn off, replaced by the grinding gray misery of occupation. But in the newly reclaimed offices of the Vichy government, Pierre Laval was manic with energy. He had returned to power with a singular conviction. The only way to save France was to make himself indispensable to Adolf Hitler. He believed that if he could just prove, publicly, undeniably, that France was a true ideological ally, Germany would grant them a privileged place in the New World Order. He decided to make a gesture so radical, so shocking, that it would silence his critics in Berlin forever. On June 22, 1942, Laval sat before a microphone to address the nation. It was a date heavy with symbolism, the one-year anniversary of the German invasion of Russia. Across the occupied zone and the free zone, families gathered around their crackling radios, expecting the usual platitudes about patience and discipline. Instead, they heard a suicide note for a nation's soul. In his distinct, gravelly voice, Laval uttered the sentence that would hang around his neck until the day he died. "I wish for a German victory," he declared, pausing for effect, because without it, Bolshevism would establish itself everywhere. The silence that followed in millions of French kitchens was deafening. This was not just collaboration. This was high treason broadcast live. For a French prime minister to openly pray for the triumph of the army that was currently occupying Paris, holding 2 million Frenchmen prisoner and starving the population, was a psychological violence that is hard to overstate. Laval thought he was being a sophisticated geopolitical strategist, positioning France as the bulwark against communism. To the mechanic in Lyon or the housewife in Lille, he sounded like a madman who had fallen in love with his jailer. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer the shield of France. He was now the cheerleader for its executioner. But Hitler did not want cheers. He wanted flesh. The German war machine was bleeding out on the Russian steppes. The factories of the Reich were empty because every able-bodied German man was at the front. Berlin sent Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary for labor deployment, a brutal bull-necked Nazi known as the slave driver of Europe, to Vichy with a simple demand. He wanted French workers, hundreds of thousands of them. Laval saw this demand not as a catastrophe but as a transaction. He sat down with Sauckel and negotiated the infamous relève, the relief. It was a piece of mathematics so cynical it chills the blood. Laval proposed a trade. For every 3 French skilled workers who volunteered to go to Germany, the Nazis would release 1 French prisoner of war. 3 for 1. He sold it to the French public as a noble sacrifice. "Workers," he implored, "go to Germany to release your brothers." It was a lie wrapped in a swindle. The trains left for Germany packed with workers, but the trains returning with prisoners were few and far between. The Germans rigged the numbers, releasing mostly the sick and the elderly, who were of no use to them. Laval had turned the French state into a recruitment agency for the enemy's war effort. He covered the walls of Paris with propaganda posters showing happy French workers in German factories, while in reality he was shipping them into a hell of Allied bombing raids and slave labor conditions. When the volunteers inevitably stopped coming, the mass slipped completely. The relève became the STO, Service du Travail Obligatoire, compulsory labor service. It was a draft. Police were sent to raid factories, cinemas, and homes, dragging young men out to fill the quotas. This was Laval's ultimate betrayal of his own people. He used French gendarmes to hunt French boys for German masters. The consequences were disastrous, though not in the way Laval expected. The STO backfired spectacularly. Tens of thousands of young men refused to report. They fled their homes, taking to the mountains, the forests, and the scrublands, the maquis. Before the STO, the resistance was a small collection of spies and saboteurs. After the STO, it became an army. Laval, in his desperate attempt to appease Hitler, had inadvertently created the very force that would eventually destroy him. He had given the youth of France a stark choice: slave for the Germans or fight for freedom. They chose to fight. By late 1942, Pierre Laval was the most hated man in French history. He lived in a bubble of paranoia, surrounded by bodyguards, traveling in armored cars with the blinds drawn. He smoked pack after pack of cigarettes, his skin turning a sickly yellow, his eyes darting at shadows. He told himself he was the only one suffering for the greater good, the only one willing to dirty his hands to keep the nation from being completely crushed. But the dirt was turning into blood. He had started by trading words, then he traded workers. Now the Germans were asking for something even darker. They were asking for the Jews. And Laval, the pragmatist, the deal-maker, the man who couldn't say no, checked his ledger and prepared to negotiate human lives as if they were sacks of grain. If the labor draft was a crime against the French nation, what followed was a crime against humanity itself. By the sweltering summer of 1942, the Nazi machinery of extermination had turned its gaze toward France. The grim accountants of the SS in Berlin had set their quotas. They wanted Jews, thousands of them. They demanded that the French police round them up and hand them over to the trains waiting at the stations. For any other leader, this would have been the moment to resign, to protest, or to flee. For Pierre Laval, it was just another negotiation, another grim item on the agenda, to be managed, bartered, and processed. Laval looked at the demand and applied his twisted logic of sovereignty. He reasoned that if the German SS were allowed to hunt Jews on French streets, it would be a violation of French independence. It would prove that Vichy was powerless. So he made a decision that defies comprehension. He offered to do the job for them. He told the Germans that the French police, his police, would carry out the arrests. He believed he was saving the dignity of the French state by making French gendarmes the agents of genocide. He struck a bargain that he believed was clever. He would sacrifice the foreign Jews, refugees from Poland, Germany, and Russia, who had fled to France for safety, in order to shield the French-born Jews. It was a monstrous arithmetic, trading lives like currency. On July 16, 1942, the result of Laval's diplomacy unfolded in the streets of Paris. It was codenamed Operation Spring Breeze, but history knows it as the Veldiv Roundup. In the early hours of the morning, 4,500 French policemen banged on doors across the city. They dragged families out of bed, men, women, the elderly, the sick. They herded them onto buses, driving them through the indifferent streets of the capital to the Velodrome d'Hiver, an indoor cycling stadium near the Eiffel Tower. Inside the Velodrome, the conditions were apocalyptic. Over 13,000 people were crammed into a space meant for bicycle races. The windows were sealed shut. The summer sun beat down on the glass roof, turning the stadium into a greenhouse. There was no food. There was almost no water. There were only a handful of toilets, which overflowed almost immediately. The stench of sweat, excrement, and fear was so thick it made the guards retch. For 5 days, families lived in this squalor, waiting for the buses that would take them to the transit camps of Drancy and Pithiviers, the antechambers of Auschwitz. But amidst this horror, the darkest detail belongs entirely to Pierre Laval. Initially, the German orders did not explicitly demand the deportation of children under 16. They were focused on adult labor. But Laval looked at the logistics and saw an administrative problem. If parents were deported, the French state would have to care for thousands of orphans. To avoid this burden, Laval made a suggestion that chills the blood. He proposed that the children should go too. He framed it in language that is sickening in its hypocrisy. He called it a humanitarian measure. He argued that it would be cruel to separate families, so the humane thing to do was to let the children accompany their parents to the east. He knew, or he should have known, that the destination was not a labor camp. He knew that sending a 5-year-old on a cattle car to Poland was a death sentence, but he signed the order anyway. He cleared the orphanage rosters with the stroke of a pen. Because of Pierre Laval, thousands of children were pulled from French foster homes and schools. They were loaded into boxcars, scared and crying, clutching dolls and teddy bears. They were shipped across the continent to the gas chambers, largely because the Prime Minister of France didn't want the paperwork of looking after them. We have accounts of Laval during this period. He sat in his office, chain-smoking as always, his white tie speckled with ash, dismissing the protests of church leaders. When a Protestant pastor came to beg for mercy for the Jews, Laval reportedly replied with a cold sneer, "I do not do sentimentality. I do prophylaxis." He viewed the Jews as a foreign virus in the French body, and he was the surgeon cutting them out. He convinced himself that by sacrificing the foreign Jews, he was saving the real France. This was the final disintegration of the man. The lawyer who had once fought for the poor in Aubervilliers was now organizing the logistics of mass murder. He had become a bureaucrat of death, blinded by his own arrogance, believing that he was playing a grand game of chess with history. But the trains rolling east were not abstract pieces on a board. They were filled with screaming human beings. By the time the war ended, 76,000 Jews had been deported from France. Fewer than 3,000 returned. Laval didn't pull the trigger, and he didn't turn on the gas, but he stamped the tickets. And as the smoke rose from the chimneys of Birkenau, it mingled with the smoke of his cigarettes in Vichy, an eternal testament to the banality of his evil. By the summer of 1944, the illusion was shattering. The fortress Europe that Laval had bet his soul on was being breached. On June 6, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of France had begun. In Vichy, the atmosphere turned from grim determination to frantic terror. The Hôtel du Parc, once the hive of collaboration, now smelled of burning paper. Officials were shredding files, packing suitcases, and looking for back exits. But Pierre Laval remained in his office, paralyzed by a strange, delusional calm. He truly believed, even as the American tanks rolled toward Paris, that he could still negotiate a way out. He thought he could convene the old National Assembly, the very parliament he had destroyed in 1940, and hand power back to them, presenting himself as the man who had kept the seat warm for democracy. It was his final, most pathetic fantasy. The Germans were not about to let their prize puppet walk away and rewrite history. On August 17, 1944, the SS kicked down the doors of the government buildings. This was not an evacuation, it was a kidnapping. They told Marshal Pétain and Pierre Laval that they were being moved for their own safety. In reality, they were being taken as hostages. The cars were loaded at gunpoint. Laval looked out the rear window as Vichy faded into the distance, knowing he would never see France as a free man again. They were driven east, across the border, into the burning heart of the Third Reich. Their destination was Sigmaringen, a town in southern Germany dominated by a colossal, menacing castle perched on a cliff above the Danube. The castle of Sigmaringen became the stage for the final surreal act of the collaborationist tragedy. It was a Gothic nightmare. The ancestral home of the Hohenzollern dynasty was turned into a gilded cage for the wreckage of the French government. Life in Sigmaringen was a theater of the absurd. 6,000 French collaborators, politicians, militia members, writers, and their families, were crammed into the town, fleeing the wrath of the liberation. Inside the castle, a phantom government played at ruling a country that no longer existed. The ultra-collaborators, men like Fernand de Brinon and the fascist fanatic Jacques Doriot, set up a French government commission. They issued decrees, appointed ministers, and broadcast radio speeches to a France that was already hanging out the tricolor flags of victory. They lived in a hallucination, pretending the war could still be won with secret weapons and ideological purity. But Pierre Laval refused to join the play. He withdrew into a sullen, stubborn silence. He locked himself in his assigned suite on the castle's second floor, refusing to participate in the charade. When the Germans demanded he lead this government in exile, he snapped, "I am a prisoner, not a prime minister. I cannot govern from a German fortress." He spent his days pacing the antique carpets, chain-smoking until the air was blue, writing feverish notes to justify his actions. He was surrounded by men who wanted to fight to the death, but Laval knew the game was over. He was simply trying to run down the clock, hoping to survive the apocalypse. The atmosphere in the castle was suffocating. It was described by the writer Louis-Ferdinand Céline, who was also trapped there, as a tap dance of skeletons. The grand halls echoed with the arguments of desperate men. Food was scarce. The heating failed. The once powerful ministers huddled in their coats, waiting for the news from the front, which grew worse every day. They were ghosts haunting a German museum, while outside, the RAF bombers turned the cities of the Reich into rubble. By April 1945, The thunder of French artillery, General de Latre's First Army, could be heard in the distance. The end was days away. The rats began to flee the sinking castle. Laval knew he could not fall into the hands of the Free French forces. They would lynch him on the nearest lamppost. He needed to get to a neutral country. He needed one last deal. He managed to secure a Junkers plane. On May 2nd, 1945, as Berlin was falling to the Russians, Pierre Laval took off from a crumbling German airfield. He flew south, over the burning ruins of Europe, toward Spain. He believed that General Francisco Franco, the dictator he had helped during the diplomacy of the 1930s, would offer him sanctuary. He landed in Barcelona, exhausted, stepping out onto the tarmac with his wife, Eugenie, expecting a welcome. He was wrong. Franco was a survivor, just like Laval, but he was smarter. Franco saw which way the wind was blowing. He didn't want to anger the victorious Americans by harboring a war criminal. He interned Laval in the fortress of Montjuic for 3 months, ignoring his pleas. Laval sat in a Spanish cell, watching the Mediterranean, realizing that the brotherhood of dictators was a lie. There is no honor among thieves when the police are at the door. In July 1945, the order came. Franco was expelling him, but he wasn't sending him to Switzerland or South America. He was handing him back to the Allies. Laval was put on a plane bound for Austria, to the American occupation zone. The handover at the airport in Linz, Austria, was the final humiliation. The Americans didn't want him either. They treated him like a contaminated package. They immediately handed him over to the French military authorities. As Laval stepped off the plane and saw the French uniforms, the uniforms of the new army, the army of de Gaulle, he knew the circle had closed. He was handcuffed. The man who had ruled France, who had dined with kings and shaken hands with Hitler, was now just a prisoner with a number. He was flown back to Paris to Le Bourget Airport, the same airport where he had once landed to cheering crowds after his diplomatic summits. This time, he was shoved into a police van. The drive to Fresnes prison was a journey through a city he no longer recognized. Paris was free. The swastikas were gone. The streets were filled with people who whispered his name like a curse. As the heavy gates of Fresnes slammed shut behind him, Pierre Laval was stripped of his suit, his tie, and his dignity. He was left with only one thing, the small glass ampoule of cyanide he had sewn into his coat lining back in Sigmaringen. He checked it with trembling fingers. It was still there. It was his last ace in the hole. He sat on his cot in the damp silence of cell 12, listening to the jeers of the other prisoners echoing down the block. The trial was coming. The reckoning was here. And Pierre Laval, the great negotiator, began to prepare his opening statement for a jury that had already dug his grave. October 1945. France is liberated, but it is not at peace. The streets of Paris are awash with the euphoria of victory, but underneath there is a dark undercurrent of vengeance. The epuration, the purge, is in full swing. Women accused of sleeping with Germans are having their heads shaved in public squares. Militiamen are being lined up against walls without trial. The nation is trying to scrub itself clean of 4 years of shame, and it needs a scapegoat. It needs a human vessel into which it can pour all the sins of the occupation. Marshal Pétain has already been tried, but his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to his advanced age. That leaves only one man to pay the ultimate price, Pierre Laval. The trial of Pierre Laval, which opened on October 4th, 1945, was not a legal proceeding. It was a judicial lynching. It took place in the High Court of Justice, but there was no justice to be found there. The jury was packed with former resistance members and parliamentary enemies who had hated Laval for decades. The judge, Pierre Mongibaud, made no attempt to hide his bias, openly insulting the defendant from the bench. Laval, now gaunt and haggard, his famous suits hanging loosely on his frame, tried to defend himself. He arrived with crates of documents, prepared to argue the nuances of his double game. He wanted to prove that he had acted as a shield, sacrificing his reputation to spare France from the fate of Poland. But the court didn't want to hear arguments. They wanted a confession. Every time Laval tried to speak, he was drowned out by jeers from the jury in the gallery. "Traitor!" they screamed. "Nazi hireling!" At one point, the chaos became so unbearable that Laval, trembling with rage, slammed his portfolio shut and declared, "I will no longer answer. You have already condemned me. This is not a court, it is a circus." He refused to return to the dock for the final days. On October 9th, in his absence, the verdict was delivered. Death by firing squad. National indignity. Confiscation of all property. It was a foregone conclusion. Laval spent his final days in the condemned cell at Frayne, writing feverishly. He wrote to his lawyer, his daughter Josée, and his wife Eugénie. He was calm, possessing the eerie clarity of a man who has accepted his fate but refuses to accept the method of it. He was determined to deny the French government the satisfaction of his public execution. He would not let them turn his death into a patriotic spectacle. On the morning of October 15th, the cycle closed. Inside the damp walls of cell 12, the glass ampoule shattered between his teeth. But the cyanide, degraded by time and moisture, failed to deliver the swift Roman death Laval had planned. Instead of stopping his heart, it set his body on fire. He fell to the floor, convulsing, his throat seizing up, his body rejecting the poison in violent spasms. What followed is a scene unique in the annals of capital punishment. The Attorney General, Pierre-André Mornay, stood over the writhing body of the former Prime Minister and made a decision that stripped the last veneer of civilization from the proceedings. He must not escape, Mornay panicked. He must be shot. The prison doctors were ordered to save the patient solely for the purpose of killing him. For 2 agonizing hours, Cell 12 became a makeshift operating theater of horror. They pinned Laval down as he retched and kicked. They forced a rubber tube down his raw, chemical-burned throat. They pumped gallons of water into his stomach and sucked it back out, washing away the cyanide. They injected him with camphor and caffeine to jumpstart his failing heart. It was a torture session, masquerading as a medical procedure. Laval, semi-conscious, groaned in protest, begging them to let him die. "It is my right," he rasped, coughing up blood and bile. "Leave me be." But the state was relentless. They needed him alive. They needed him conscious enough to be tied to a stake. By 11:30 a.m., the doctors declared that his heart was strong enough to withstand the firing squad. It was a medical opinion of supreme absurdity. Laval was a wreck. He could not stand without support. He was drenched in sweat and vomit. Yet, as the guards lifted him up, the old vanity, the old steel, flickered one last time. He asked for his clothes. He demanded his white tie. He dressed slowly, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He put on the tie, now stained and crooked. He wrapped his tricolor scarf around his neck, the symbol of the office he still believed he held legitimately. He turned to his lawyer, Jacques Baraduc, and said, "I did not want to die by French bullets, but tell them I die with France in my heart." At 12:20 p.m., the procession moved to the prison courtyard. It was a damp, gray afternoon. A hearse waited to transport him a mere few hundred yards to the execution post. He was simply too weak to walk the distance. When he stepped out of the vehicle, he saw the firing squad, 12 soldiers from the colonial troops, young men who looked nervous. A wooden stake stood in front of a sandy embankment. Laval refused the blindfold. He refused to be tied to the post, though he leaned heavily against it to keep from collapsing. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at the gray sky. There was no hatred in his eyes anymore, only a profound exhaustion-filled sadness. He tried to speak, to give the order to fire himself, as was the custom for high-ranking officials, but his voice was destroyed by the stomach pumping. It came out as a croak. "Vive la France," he whispered. It was not a shout, it was a sigh. Fire! The volley thundered in the enclosed courtyard. Pierre Laval's body jerked violently as the bullets tore through him. He slid down the stairs, slumping into the mud. The officer in charge walked forward, drew his revolver, and delivered the coup de grace, a single shot to the ear. The man who had defined an era, who had thought he could outsmart history, was finally silent. He was buried quickly in an unmarked grave in the Thiers cemetery, a pariah in the soil he claimed to save. Pierre Laval was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was not a sadist like Himmler or a fanatic like Goebbels. He was something perhaps more terrifying because it is more common. He was a man of absolute unwavering pragmatism who lost his moral compass. He was the ultimate technician of power. He believed that every problem had a solution, every man had a price, and every disaster could be managed if you were just clever enough. His tragedy, and the tragedy he inflicted on France, was his hubris. He believed he could ride the tiger of Nazism without being eaten. He believed he could compromise with evil to prevent a greater evil. But evil does not compromise, it contaminates. By trying to save the furniture of the French state, he ended up burning down the house. He sold the soul of his country in exchange for a seat at a table where he was never welcome. History has handed down its verdict. He is the villain of the French 20th century, the patron saint of the lesser of two evils. He is the dark reflection of the politician who believes that principles are a luxury and that survival is the only virtue. In the end, the white tie was not a badge of honor nor a mark of shame. It was a shroud for a man who forgot that there are some things in this world that cannot be negotiated,